and took his 2 wives, his 2 maids, and his 11 children, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream, and likewise everything that he had. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he struck him on the hip side. Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the day is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." So he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then the man said, "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved." The sun rose upon him as he passed Peniel, limping because of his hip. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
We'll read from Psalm 121 response. I will lift up my eyes to the hills. From where is my help to come?
My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth.
The Lord will not let your foot be moved, nor will the one who watches over you fall asleep.
Behold, the Keeper of Israel will neither slumber nor sleep.
The Lord watches over you. The Lord is your shade at your right hand.
The sun will not strike in the day, nor the moon at night.
The Lord will preserve you from all evil and will keep you alive.
The Lord will watch over your going out and your coming in, from this time forth forevermore.
A reading from Paul's second letter to Timothy. But as for you, continue in what you have learned and firmly believed, knowing from whom you learned it, and how from childhood you have known the sacred writings that are able to instruct you for salvation through faith in Christ Jesus. All Scripture is inspired by God and is useful for teaching, for reproof, for correction, and for training in righteousness, so that everyone who belongs to God may be proficient, equipped for every good work. In the presence of God and of Christ Jesus, who is to judge the living and the dead, and in view of his appearing and his kingdom, I solemnly urge you, proclaim the message. Be persistent whether the time is favorable or unfavorable. Convince, rebuke, and encourage with the utmost patience in teaching. For the time is coming when people will not put up with sound doctrine, but having itching ears, they will accumulate for themselves teachers to suit their own desires, and will turn away from listening to the truth and wander away to myths. As for you, always be sober, endure suffering, do the work of an evangelist, carry out your ministry fully. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
The
in a certain city there was a judge who neither feared God nor had respect for people. In that city there was a widow who kept coming to him and saying, "Grant me justice against my opponent." For a while he refused, but later he said to himself, "Though I have no fear of God and no respect for anyone, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will grant her justice, so that she may not wear me out by continually coming." And the Lord said, "Listen to what the unjust judge says. And will not God grant justice to his chosen ones who cry to him day and night? Will he delay long in helping them? I tell you, he will quickly grant justice to them. And yet, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth?" The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord Christ. Please be seated. For some reason, we have come to believe that God is above reproach, that we should not ever come to argue with God, to question God, to plead with God. But the Bible is filled with stories of people who challenge God when life gets difficult. Think of Abraham. He questioned God when they said that Elizabeth would have a son, even though they were well up in years. Moses argued with the burning bush and often challenged God during times in the wilderness. The prophets were none too keen on the words that God had told them to speak, and Jonah even ran away from God, only to end up arguing with God when he said that he would save the evil people who had turned from their ways. Because the Bible is not really a history book where we learn about people, put those facts in our brains and just kind of keep them there like some type of history that we never use. Rather, the Bible is a living, breathing book telling the story of God's people and God's love for all creation. Our story is in the midst of the biblical story. The people of old are much like us. When we hear stories from the Bible, it's helpful to say, where am I in that story? Who am I? The overarching message of all of today's readings is not to fear God, but to come, to plead, to argue our case. And it's okay to argue like the woman argued with that judge. Or even when we hear about Jacob wrestling with God. So today I would like to focus on Jacob, a man whose life is parallel to ours in many ways, a man who is deeply flawed, but a man who is still blessed by God. So here is Jacob's story. Jacob was the son of Isaac and Rebekah, the grandson of Abraham. Rebekah became pregnant when she was in her 40s, a little bit old in those days, and it was a tough pregnancy. It was like there was a struggle going on in her womb. God told her, there are 2 nations in your womb, and they will be set apart. The older will serve the younger. I can about imagine her mind going, oh my gosh, what is going on here? And after 9 months, Rebekah gave birth to twins. The first twin to be born was named Esau, and the second was Jacob. And names in that time were very important because they told something about the person. Esau meant hairy. He had an extremely large amount of body hair. And Jacob means heel. Because when he was born, he was still holding on to his brother's heel. And when they were growing up, much like his father. He went out hunting, he ate wild game, berries, and all of those tough things, while Jacob was his mother's favorite. Jacob was also a rather deceptive guy, a weasel and a cheat, if you want to be honest about it. He tricked his father into taking his birthright away from Esau. The older boy would always have that, and he stole it as the younger one. And that was no small thing, because now he got twice the inheritance, and he would be considered the older son. Jacob was all about himself. As a teenager, Jacob pulled off the deception of a lifetime. Esau was gone on a hunting trip. His father was old and blind. He could only rely on his touch. And with his mother, Rachel's help, Jacob once again deceived his father, this time into receiving his father's blessing. A blessing which rightly belonged to Esau, but he stole it with deception. And when Jacob was exposed, Esau was furious and threatened to kill Jacob. And Jacob did the only thing that a normal person would do. He ran for his life. Well, one night, Jacob had a dream. And in this dream, he saw a stairway into heaven. And angels were going up and down this stairway. And he heard a voice from God that he would be protected by God forever. After this dream, Jacob had all kinds of misadventures. And eventually he ended up living with his uncle Laban. And he fell in love with his daughter, Rachel. And Jacob was so in love with Rachel that he agreed to work for Laban for 7 years before he would be able to take her in marriage. Finally, those 7 years were up. The day came, and Jacob and his bride entered the marriage tent. And when morning came, Jacob realized he had been tricked by Laban. He had spent the night with Rachel's sister Leah. Not sure how that all worked out, but in the morning he realized what had happened, and he was furious. He was now married to the wrong woman. But he agreed to work for 7 more years so that he could have the hand of his sweetheart, Rachel. Finally, after 14 years, Jacob had the bride he loved, but he was angry with Laban, and he cheated him in business dealings to get even. Did I say that Jacob was kind of a dishonest guy, that he was kind of a cheat and a weasel? But Jacob was a rather successful agribusinessman. He had riches beyond measure. There was little that he lacked in material ways. He had a huge tent to live in. He had 2 wives, 10 children. He had a fleet of the newest camels you could possibly buy, all new models. He had everything. He had sheep and cattle and donkeys. You name it, Jacob had it. But he was homesick. He was not proud of the man that he had become. He wanted to return home because God had promised him a safe return. A dream he had had 20 years ago. But there was a problem, a big problem. Esau was coming with 400 men, and he wanted to meet Jacob. He wanted to meet him face to face. Well, when Jacob heard this, he was obviously kind of concerned. So he divided up his wives, his children, and everything he had. Because at least he figured if Esau came in with this big army, at least he could keep track of what he had. And that night, Jacob went to sleep. But he was very restless. He was about to meet his brother the next day, the same brother he had cheated out of his birthright, the same brother he had cheated out of his blessing. And as he was about to fall asleep, a man came by, and the two wrestled all night, no one gaining an advantage. And as dawn was breaking, the man struck Jacob on the hip, and his hip went out of joint. The man cried out, "Let me go!" He said, "What is your name?" And Jacob said, "My name is Jacob." He said, "You will no longer be named Jacob, but Israel. You have wrestled with God and have prevailed." And Jacob asked the man's name, and the man said, "Why do you need to know?" So the man blessed Jacob. And Jacob declared, "I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved." Jacob spent that night wrestling with God. In the morning he received a blessing, but that was not the end. Because the sun came up, he saw Esau coming over the horizon. How would this meeting go? Would they kill each other? Because 20 years apart in anger is a long time to fester that. Jacob limped forward as he would limp the rest of his life. And as he met Esau, Esau reached out and embraced his brother. Reconciliation had taken place. So where are you in this story? Are you Jacob who has taken advantage of others for your entire life? Are you Esau who has been taken advantage of? Are you Isaac who has seen his family torn apart? Have you wrestled with God? Because if you're honest about it, when you wrestle with God, you always come out with a limp and a blessing. Life is never easy. But Jacob found out that God does not leave us alone. He is true to his promises. God welcomes those sincere and deep wrestling matches. Life often leaves us bruised, and God always returns to give us a blessing. So hear that blessing today. Through thick and thin, despite your flaws and sins, God says, "You are mine. I am with you today